Hello everyone, in this chapter we're going to talk about the integumentary system. The integumentary system is composed of the skin, the hair, oil and sweat glands, nails and sensory receptors. The term dermatology, dermato means skin. Okay, so the term dermatology is the medical specialty that deals with the structure, function and disorders of the integumentary system. The skin, also known as the cutaneous membrane, covers the external surface of the body and is the largest organ of the body in weight. In adults, the skin covers an area of about 2 square meters and weighs 4.5 up to 5 kilograms, which is about 10 to 11 pounds, and which is about 7% of the total body weight. And it ranges in thickness from 0.5 millimeters to 4 millimeters. Maintenance of homeostasis. Similar to other body systems, the integumentary system also plays a role in maintaining the homeostasis of the body. So the integumentary system maintains the body's integrity. It maintains the temperature of the body. It converts the inactive vitamin D to its active form. It provides sensory information and it maintains homeostasis. So first, we're going to talk about the structure of the skin. The layers of the skin. The skin has two major layers, the epidermis and the dermis. So the superficial, thinner portion, which is composed of the epithelial tissue, is going to be the epidermis. Epi means above. So the deeper, thicker connective tissue portion, we call it the dermis. While the epidermis is avascular, the dermis is vascular. Remember, the epidermis is made up of epithelial tissue, and then epithelial tissues do not have blood vessels, and the dermis is made up of connective tissues, right? And then they are vasculars. They do have blood vessels. So for this reason, if you cut the epidermis, you don't see any bleeding, the superficial layer of the skin, but if the cut penetrates to the dermis, you will see bleeding because dermis is made up of connective tissues and it has blood vessels and you're gonna see bleeding. So deep to the dermis, but not part of the skin, we have the subcutaneous layer, which is also called the hypodermis. Okay, so hypo means below. So this layer, it consists of areolar and adipose tissues. The subcutaneous layer serves as a storage depot for fat and contains large blood vessels that supply the skin. So the integumentary system, it includes the skin, hair, oil and sweat glands, nails and sensory receptors. And then we're going to talk about all of these organs of the integumentary system. So here in this figure, we can see a sectional view of the skin and the subcutaneous layer. Okay, so like we said, the skin is divided into 3 layers. We have the epidermis, which is the superficial, the upper layer. This is going to be the epidermis, right? Next, we have the dermis, okay? And then as you can see, like we said, the dermis is going to be the second deeper part of the skin, and it is composed of dense irregular connective tissue, and it has collagen and elastic fibers. So based on its tissue structure, the tissue can be divided into a thin superficial papillary region and a thick deeper reticular region. So if you can see here, the dermis is divided into 2 regions, the papillary and reticular. So this upper layer right below the epidermis is going to be the papillary region, and then from here till here, this region is going to be the reticular region. The papillary region, okay, it makes up about 1/5 of the thickness of the total layer. It contains thin collagen and fine elastic fibers. Its surface area is greatly increased by the dermal papillae. So here, as we can see here in this figure, so those are going to be the dermal papillae, and then which are small nipple-shaped structures that project into the undersurface of the epidermis. And all dermal papillae, they contain capillary loops. Okay, so here, as you can see, we have the capillary loops, which are the blood vessels, the thin form of blood vessels. And then some also contain tactile receptors. We call those corpuscle of touch, or the Mischner's corpuscle, okay, which we have it here, and another one here, as we can see in the figure. And we have nerve endings that are sensitive to touch, and then here we can see the nerve endings. Okay, so still other dermal papillae also contain free nerve endings, dendrites that lack any apparent structural specialization. So the different free nerve endings initiate signals that give rise to sensations of warmth, coolness, pain, tickling, and itching. So this is for the papillary region of the dermis. We also have the reticular region of the dermis. So the reticular region, which is attached to the subcutaneous layer, which brings us to the third layer of the skin, which is the subcutaneous layer, or we also call it the hypodermis. Okay, so it contains bundles of thick collagen fibers, scattered fibroblasts, and various wandering cells such as macrophages, and then we're going to talk about all those different cells. So we also see some adipose cells. Okay, so here we can see, here we have the adipose tissues, okay, again, which is part of the subcutaneous layer, which can be present in the deepest part of the layer along with some coarse elastic fibers. So the surfaces of the palms, fingers, soles, and toes have a series of ridges and grooves, right? So they appear either as straight lines or as a pattern of loops, as on the tips of the digits of your fingers. These epidermal ridges, okay, so those are the epidermal ridges, as we can see here, are produced during the third month of fetal development as downward projections of the epidermis, and then into the dermis between the dermal papillae of the papillary region. Okay, so as you can see here on top of the epidermis, here we can see we have the hair shaft. We're going to talk about the hair shaft. Here we have a papillary vascular plexus. It's called papillary because it's found in the papillary region of the dermis. Okay, so here down in the subcutaneous layer, we have blood vessels such as veins and arteries, right? And then we can see that they follow in the dermis, which is made up of connective tissues. Here we have the cutaneous vascular plexus because it's found in the subcutaneous layer, right? So those nerves, the yellow ones, those are going to be the sensory nerve. Here we have a laminated corpuscle, which is also called the Pacinian corpuscle. So those are any numerous small oval bodies that are sensitive to pressure. They're found in the skin of the fingers and elsewhere and are formed of concentric layers of connective tissue, which are those Pacinian corpuscle. They are nerve endings in the skin responsible for sensitivity to vibrations and pressure. And then vibration roll may be used to detect surface, such as the roof versus the smooth surface. Okay, so also here we have apocrine sweat glands, and then here we have the eccrine sweat glands. Okay, so as you can see, the apocrine sweat glands is more lower in the layer of the skin. It's more closer to the subcutaneous layer. And then whereas the eccrine sweat gland is more, it looks more condensed, and then it's more closer to the epidermis than the subcutaneous layer. The apocrine glands, they open into the hair follicles leading to the surface of the skin, which brings us here to the hair follicle, the hair root, and then here we have an erectile pili muscle, right? Those parts. And then as for the eccrine glands, okay, the eccrine glands, we said that they occur over most of your body and open directly onto the surface of the skin. And then, like we said, the eccrine gland is more condensed and is closer to the epidermis. The apocrine gland down here is going to be more closer to the hypodermis. Also here we have a sebaceous gland which produces oil. Here we have the sweat pores where the sweat is secreted. Components of the integumentary system. So here if we look at the first figure here, we have a sectional view of the skin 60 times magnified under a light microscope. So here we can see the layers of the skin. Here we have the epidermis, the top layer, right? And then we have the dermis. Like we said, the dermis is divided into two layers, the top thin layer, which is the papillary region, and then the bottom layer, which is thicker, that's the reticular region, right? And then here we have the sebaceous glands, we have the hair root, and then here we have the hair follicle. So here, if we look at this figure on the right, we have a sectional view of dermal papillae and epidermal ridges and epidermal layers. And then as you can see here, so here, if we look at it, we have the top layer. This is going to be the epidermis, right? And then here, this is where the dermis starts, and then we have the papillary region first. Okay, so the epidermis, it has 5 different layers. Okay, so it has stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basal. Okay, so the epithelial layer, the epidermis, is made up of 5 different layers. And then a good acronym to remember those 5 different layers is, so remember this sentence: come, let's get sun burned. Okay, so here the first letter, the C from the word come, is for the corneum, the L from let is for the lucidum, the G from get is for the granulosum, the S from the sun is for spinosum, and B from burn is for the stratum basal. Okay, so here, this is a way to remember the 5 layers of the epidermis. And then here we have from the papillary region of the dermis, we have the corpuscle of touch. Here, if we look at the figure here, this is under scanning electron microscope, and then here we can see the epidermis and the dermis, and then as you can see, the epidermis is made up of 5 different layers. And then here, this is another figure. It shows the epidermal ridges and sweat pores. So as you can see, those are going to be the sweat pores, and then those lines are going to be the epidermal ridges. The epidermis, keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The epidermis is composed of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. It contains 4 principal types of cells. We have the keratinocytes, we have the melanocytes, we have intraepidermal macrophages, or we call it the Langerhans cell, and then we have the tactile epithelial cells, or the Merkel cells. So the 90% of the cells in the epidermis, they are keratinocytes. They produce keratin, which is tough, fibrous protein that helps protect the skin and underlying tissues from abrasions, heat, microbes, and chemical. The 8% of the cells are melanocytes, which make melanin, which is this yellow, red, or brown, black pigment that contributes to skin color. Because the number of melanocytes is about the same in all people, the differences in skin color are due mainly to the amount of pigment the melanocytes produce. Okay, so it doesn't have to do with the amount of number of melanocytes we have. No, it has to do with the amount of pigment that melanocytes produces, and then that differentiates the skin colors between people. And then we have the intraepidermal macrophages, or the Langerhans cells. Those arise from the red bone marrow, and they migrate to the epidermis, where they constitute a small fraction of the epidermal cells. They participate in immune responses, okay, and then mounted against microbes that invade the skin and are easily damaged by the UV light. Their role in the immune system response basically is to help other cells of the immune system recognize an invading microbes and eventually destroy it. And finally, we have the tactile epithelial cells, or the Merkel cells. Those are the least numerous of the epidermal cells. They are located in the deepest layer of the epidermis, and where they can contact the flattened process of a sensory neuron, which is the nerve cells, a structure called a tactile disc or a Merkel disc. Okay, so tactile epithelial cells and their associated tactile discs, their job is to detect the touch sensations. So here in this figure, we can see the four major types of cells of the epidermis. So like we said, this is the keratinocytes, right? They produce keratin, and then 90% of the cells in the epidermis is made up of the keratinocytes. The 8% is made up of melanocytes, and then their job is to produce melanin, right? And then we have the intraepidermal macrophage, or the Langerhans cells. We said that they mount immune responses against microbes that invade the skin. And finally, we have here the tactile epithelial, or the Merkel cells, right? And then we said those are the least numerous, and their associated tactile discs, or the Merkel discs, okay? They detect the sensation of touch. The epidermis, types of skin. So we have two types of skin. We have thin, hairy skin, and we have thick, hairless skin. So the thin, hairy skin covers all body regions except the palms, palmar surfaces of digits and soles. As for the thick skin, which is hairless, covers the palms, the palmar surfaces of digits and soles. So here, if we look at the figure on the left and compare it with the right, so the figure on the left is a thin skin, and then the figure on the right is the epidermis of the thick skin. And then, like we said, the epidermis is made up of 5 different layers. So if we look at the thick skin, as you can see, we have the stratum basal, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, and stratum corneum. Okay, we can see we have the all 5 layers of the skin. If we look at the epidermis of the thin skin, here we can see it's going to be this part, which is the epidermis. We have the stratum basal, we have the stratum spinosum, we have this stratum granulosum, and we have the stratum corneum. Okay, so as you can see, the stratum lucidum is missing in the thin skin, right? So it has 4 layers instead of the 5. So the epidermis is composed of 4 layers in the thin skin, and is composed of 5 layers in the thick skin. So we're going to talk about the different layers. First, I'm going to start talking about the bottom layer, which is the stratum basal. So this one is the deepest layer, is composed of single row of cuboidal or columnar keratinocytes that contain scattered keratin intermediate filaments. Stem cells undergo cell division to produce new keratinocytes, so it's a site of active cell division. And melanocytes and tactile epithelial cells associated with tactile discs are scattered among the keratinocytes. Next, we have the stratum spinosum, which has 8 to 10 rows of many-sided keratinocytes with bundles of keratin intermediate filaments, and it contains projections of melanocytes and intraepidermal macrophages. Next, we have the stratum granulosum, which has 3 to 5 rows of flattened keratinocytes in which organelles are beginning to degenerate. Cells contain the protein keratohyalin, which converts keratin intermediate filaments into keratin, and lipid-filled lamellar granules. Next, we have the stratum lucidum. So it's present only in skin of the fingertips, palms, and the soles, and it consists of 4 to 6 rows of clear, flat, dead keratinocytes with large amounts of keratin. Okay, so we can find the stratum lucidum only in the thick skin, right? And then finally, we have the stratum corneum, which has few to 50 or more rows of dead flat keratinocytes that contain mostly keratin and can form calluses. So that's why the stratum corneum is going to be the topmost layer of the epidermis. So here this figure is showing the 4 principal cell types in epidermis of thick skin. So first let's look at the 5 layers. So we have, this is the epidermis, right? And then we have the stratum corneum, right? We have the stratum lucidum, we have the stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and down here we have the stratum basal. Okay, and then so that's for the epidermis, and then this part here is gonna be the dermis. Okay, so this is from the superficial till deep, right? The epidermis is superficial, and then the dermis is deeper, right? So here in the stratum corneum, we can, like we said, we discussed in the previous slide, we have that keratinocytes. In the stratum granulosum, we have the lamellar granules. Part of the stratum spinosum, we have again keratinocytes, and we have the intradermal macrophages. And here we can see we have a part of the stratum basal, we have the tactile epithelial cells, and then here we have the tactile disc, which is part of the dermis. We have the sensory neuron, which is part of the dermis, and then here inside the stratum basal we have the melanocytes. So here this table is a good summary of the 5 layers of the epidermis or the epidermal strata. Now we're going to talk about the skin pigments. Melanin, first, is a class of compounds found in plants and animals where it serves predominantly as a pigment. The class of pigments are derivatives of the amino acid tyrosine. The most common form of biological melanin is the eumelanin, which is a black-brown polymer of dihydroxyindole carboxylic acid and their reduced forms. It's okay, you don't have to know all those details. Another common form of melanin is the pheomelanin, which is a red-brown polymer of benzothionein units largely responsible for red hair and freckles. Hair color is primarily due to the amount and type of melanin that we have present in the keratinized cells of our hairs. So we have melanin, we have hemoglobin, and we have the keratin, right? Those are pigments that impact a wide variety of colors to skin. The amount of melanin causes the skin color to vary from pale yellow to reddish brown and all the way to black. The difference between the 2 forms of melanin, we have the pheomelanin and the eumelanin, okay, those 2, is most apparent in the hair. So melanocytes, which is the, as we can see here in the figure, which is the melanin producing cells, are most plentiful in the epidermis of the penis, the nipples of the breasts, area just around the nipples, the face, and limbs. They are also present in mucous membranes. And then those are the areas where we can see darker skin, right? Next, we have the hemoglobin. So the red color is due to hemoglobin, which is the oxygen-carrying pigment in red blood cells. And next, we have the keratin. So the keratin is a yellow-orange pigment that gives egg yolks and carrots their orange color, right? This precursor of vitamin A, which is used to synthesize pigments needed for vision, is stored in the stratum corneum, okay, and fatty areas of the dermis and subcutaneous layer in response to excessive dietary intake. So in fact, so much keratin may be deposited in the skin after eating large amounts of keratin-rich foods that the skin actually turns orange, which is especially apparent in light-skinned individuals, okay? So decreasing keratin intake will eliminate this problem. So far we talked about the first layer of the skin, which is the epidermis, and then we talked about the epidermis, the 5 layers of the epidermis in a thick skin, the 4 layers of the epidermis in a thin skin, and we also talked about the 4 types of cells that make up the epidermis. Now we're going to talk about the second deeper part of the skin, which is the dermis, which is composed of dense, irregular connective tissue containing collagen and elastic fibers. This woven network of fibers has great tensile strength, which means they resist pulling or stretching forces. The dermis also has the ability to stretch and recoil easily. It is much thicker than the epidermis, and this thickness, it varies from region to region in the body, reaching its greatest thickness on the palms and the soles. So interesting fact, okay, so the leather, okay, which we use to make belts, the leather we use to make shoes, or the baseball gloves and basketballs, is from the dried and treated dermis of other animals. So the few cells present in the dermis, they include predominantly fibroblasts with some macrophages and few adipocytes near its boundary with the subcutaneous layer. Blood vessels, nerves, glands, and hair follicles are embedded in the dermal layer. The dermis is essential to the survival of the epidermis and these adjacent layers for many important structural and functional relations. So based on its tissue structure, the dermis can be divided into a thin superficial papillary region, right, which is the outer region, and then here, and a thick, deeper reticular region, which is the inner region. So first, the papillary region, it makes up about 1/5 of the thickness of the total layer, and it contains thin collagen and fine elastic fibers. Its surface area is greatly increased by the dermal papillae. And then, like we said, the dermal papillae are those small nipple-shaped structures that project into the undersurface of the epidermis. And we also said that the all dermal papillae, they contain capillary loops or blood vessels. Some also contain tactile receptors. We call those corpuscle of touch or Michener's corpuscles, right? And nerve endings that are sensitive to touch. So still other dermal papillae also contain free nerve endings, dendrites that lack any apparent structural specialization, and those different free nerve endings, they initiate signals that give rise to sensations of warmth, coolness, pain, tickling, and itching. Now we're going to talk about the inner region, which is the reticular region, which is attached to the subcutaneous layer or the hypodermis. It contains bundles of thick collagen fibers, scattered fibroblasts, and various wandering cells such as macrophages. So some adipose cells can be present in the deepest part of the layer along with some coarse elastic fibers. The collagen fibers in the reticular region are arranged in a net-like manner and have a more regular arrangement than those in the papillary region. The more regular orientation of the large collagen fibers help the skin resist stretching, and blood vessels, nerves, hair follicles, sebaceous glands like oil, and sudoriferous glands like the sweat glands occupy the spaces between fibers. So like we said, the dermis is composed of connective tissue containing collagen and elastic fibers. And then here in this table, we can see a summary description of both the papillary region of the dermis and the reticular region. So terms related to skin color, we have the term nevus, means that a mole, whenever we have a mole on the skin. We have the term albinism, no melanin. So albinism is a congenital disorder characterized by the complete or partial absence of the pigment in the skin, hair, and eyes due to defect of an enzyme which is involved in the production of melanin. Another term we have is the vitiligo, is a chronic disorder that causes dyspigmentation patches of the skin. And then the precise cause of this disease is not known, but is most likely a combination of genetic factors coupled with a disorder of the immune system, such as autoimmune diseases. And then we have another term which is cyanotic, which means that whenever the skin turns the color blue. Jaundice, which causes the skin to look yellow. We have erythema, is the redness of the skin, and pallor is the paleness. Now we're going to talk about the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer, which is the third layer of the skin. So deep to the dermis, but not part of the skin, we have the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis, right? This layer, it consists of the areolar and adipose tissues. So fibers that extend from the dermis anchor the skin to the subcutaneous layer, which in turn attaches to underlying fascia, the connective tissue around muscle and bones. So the subcutaneous layer serves as a strong depot for fat and contains large blood vessels that supply the skin. So the region also contains nerve endings called lamellated corpuscles, that the yellow circular thingy here, as we can see in the figure. Okay, and then sometimes we can see this in the dermis as well, or the Pacinian corpuscle. They are sensitive to pressure. Okay, also the hypodermis is the common site for injection. So here, if we look at the figure on the right, we have a sectional view of skin and subcutaneous layer. We went over this figure in the previous slide. So here we have the subcutaneous layer, and like we said, we have blood vessels such as the vein, the arteries, and then it has adipose tissue where it stores fat, and then it has the lamellated Pacinian corpuscle, okay, which is part of the subcutaneous layer. Now we're going to talk about the accessory structures of the skin. Accessory structures of the skin. We have the hair, we have the skin glands, and we have nails. They develop from the embryonic epidermis. They have a host of important functions. For example, hair and nails, they protect the body, and sweat glands, they help regulate the body temperature, right? So first, let's start with the hair. So we're gonna talk about the hair and then the anatomy of the hair, and then in the next figure, we're gonna go over the structure of the hair, okay? So the hair or pili present on most body surfaces except the palms and palmar surfaces of fingers, as well as the soles and plantar surfaces of the feet, are composed of dead keratinized epidermal cells with a medulla, cortex, and cuticle. And genetic and hormonal influences, they determine the thickness of the hair and the distribution of the hair. And the function of the hair is protection, reduction of heat loss, and sensing light touch. As for the anatomy of the hair, so each hair is composed of columns of dead keratinized epidermal cells bonded together by extracellular proteins. So first we have the hair shaft. Okay, so here we have the hair shaft, is the superficial portion of the hair which projects above the surface of the skin. We're gonna see it in the next figure. We have the hair root, is the portion of the hair deep to the shaft that penetrates into the dermis and sometimes into the subcutaneous layer. The shaft and root of the hair both consist of three connective layers of cells, which are the medulla, cortex, and the cuticle of the hair, which we're going to see it in the next figure. So the inner medulla, which may be lacking in thinner hair, is composed of 2 or 3 rows of irregularly shaped cells that contain large amounts of pigment granules in dark hair, small amounts of pigment granules in gray hair, and a lack of pigment granules and the presence of air bubbles in white hair. As for the middle cortex, okay, so the middle cortex, it forms the major part of the shaft and it consists of elongated cells. The cuticle of the hair, which is the outermost layer, it consists of a single layer of thin, flat cells that are the most heavily keratinized. Cuticle cells on the shaft are arranged like shingles on the side of a house with their free edges pointing toward the end of the hair. Surrounding the root of the hair is the hair follicle. Okay, so here we have the hair follicle, which is made up of external epithelial root sheet and internal epithelial root sheet. So the external root sheet is a downward continuation of the epidermis, and the internal root sheet is produced by the matrix and forms a cellular tubular sheet of epithelium between the external root sheet and the hair. Together, the external and internal root sheet are referred to as the epithelial root sheet. So the dense dermis surrounding the hair follicle is called the dermal root sheath. The base of each hair follicle and its surrounding dermal root sheath is an onion-shaped structure. We call it the hair bulb. Okay, and then this structure houses a nipple-shaped indentation, which is the papilla of the hair. So here, housing the papilla of the hair, which contains areolar connective tissue and many blood vessels that nourish the growing hair follicle. So the bulb also contains a germinal layer of cells. We call it the hair matrix. So the hair matrix cells arise from the stratum basal, the site of cell division. Hence, hair matrix cells are responsible for the growth of existing hair and they produce new hairs when old hairs are shed. This replacement process occurs within the same follicle. And we have the hair matrix cells also give rise to the cells of the internal root sheath. So here in this figure, let's go over the structures that we went over in the previous slide. So here in the first figure, we have the hair and surrounding structures. Okay, so if you look at this figure, we have the dermis, the epidermis, dermis, and the hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer. Here we can see the blood vessels there. Here we have the apocrine sweat glands. Right here we have the papillae of the hair. This whole thing is the hair bulb, right? And then here, those in yellow, we have the hair root plexus, right? And then here we have a sebaceous gland. Here, this is gonna be the hair root. This muscle here is gonna be the erectile pili muscle, which helps the hair stand up. And then here we have an acrine sweat gland. Here in this figure, we have under scanning electron microscope 70 times magnified, we have several hair shafts showing the shingle-like cuticle cells. So here, if this is the epidermal cells, here those are gonna be the hair shaft, okay? So here from the first figure, if we take a frontal section of the hair root and magnify it, okay, so here we can see a frontal section of the hair root, and then if we look at it closely, we can see that here we have the blood vessels, of course, and then here we have the papilla of the hair. Inside the papilla of the hair, here we have the blood vessels, okay, and then here we have those melanocytes, right? And then this is gonna be the hair matrix. And then, like we said, we have the medulla, the cortex. So the first one is gonna be the medulla here. Here we have the cortex. And then here we have the cuticle of the hair. And then, like we said, we have the external, let's see, first we have the, here we have the internal root sheath, and then after that here we have the external root sheath, and then the internal and the external root sheath, they make the epithelial root sheath, and then finally the outside, we have the dermal root sheath, and then this makes the hair bulb. Okay, and then if we look at it here, a cross section of the hair root, we can see here we have the medulla, the cortex, and then the cuticle of the hair, right? And then, like we said, the hair follicle is made up of the internal root sheath, and then we have the external root sheath. Together they make the epithelial root sheath, and then here outside we have the dermal root sheath. And finally, if we look at the figure here on the right, we have a transverse section of a hair root, and then, like we said, so way in the middle, we have the medulla, we have the cortex, we have the cuticle of the hair, right? That makes the hair root. And then as for the hair follicle, which is made up of internal root sheath and external root sheath, together they make the epithelial root sheath, and then the outermost layer is going to be the dermal root sheath. Now we're going to talk about the skin glands. So in the previous chapter, we talked about how glands are epithelial cells that secrete a substance. Several kinds of exocrine glands are associated with the skin. We have the sebaceous glands. We have the, which is an oil gland, which produces oil. We have the sudoriferous sweat gland. We have the caraminous glands, and we have the mammary glands. Okay, so also here we have the erector pili. This is a muscle which is associated with the hair. That's why if this is your skin, you can see your hair having this erect position. Okay, so first let's talk about the sebaceous gland. Okay, so, or oil glands. Those are simple branched acinar glands. Remember, the acinar were the ones that are rounded, right? With few exceptions, they are connected to hair follicles. The secreting portion of sebaceous gland lies in the dermis and usually opens into the neck of a hair follicle. There are 3 trillion to 4 million sudoriferous glands, which brings us to the second one, or sweat glands in the body. The cells of these glands, they release sweat or perspiration into hair follicles or onto the skin surface through pores. Sweat glands are divided into 2 main types. We have the acrine glands and we have the apocrine glands based on their structure and type of secretion. So first, the acrine glands, acrine sweat glands, are simple, coiled tubular glands that are much more common than the apocrine sweat glands. They're distributed throughout the skin of most regions of the body, especially in the skin of the forehead, palms, and soles. Acrine sweat glands are not present, however, in the margins of the lips, nail beds of the fingers and toes, glans penis, glans clitoris, labia minora, or eardrums. The secretory portion of acrine sweat gland is located mostly in the deep dermis and sometimes in the upper subcutaneous layer of the hypodermis. The excretory duct projects through the dermis and epidermis and as a pore at the surface of the epidermis. The other one is the apocrine sweat glands. Those are also simple coiled tubular glands but have larger ducts and lumens than acrine glands. They are found mainly in the skin of the axilla, which is the armpit, the groin, the areolae, which is the pigmented areas around the nipples of the breasts, and bearded regions of the face in adult males. And So here we have the mammary glands, and like we said, mammary glands are also specialized sudoriferous apocrine glands. And here next we have the carominous glands. So those are modified sweat glands in the external ear. We call it the cerominous glands. Cere means wax. Okay, so they produce a waxy, lubricating secretion. The secretory portion of the cerominous glands lie in the subcutaneous layer, deep to the sebaceous glands. The excretory ducts open either directly onto the surface of the external auditory canal, which is the ear canal, or into ducts of the sebaceous glands. So the combined secretion of the carominous and the sebaceous glands is a yellowish material. We call it the cerumen or earwax. So cerumen, together with hairs in the external auditory canal, it provides that sticky barrier that impedes the entrance of foreign bodies and insects. So cerumen also waterproofs the canal and prevents bacteria and fungi from entering the cells. So here in this table, we can see a summary of the skin glands, including their distribution, location, secretion, and functions. So now we're going to talk about the other accessory organ of the integumentary system, which is the nails. So nails are plates of tightly packed, hard, dead, keratinized epidermal cells that form a clear, solid covering over the dorsal surfaces of the distal portions of the digits, which is the cover on top of the tip of our fingers, right? So each nail, it consists of a nail body, a free edge, and a nail root, as we can see here in this figure. So we have the free edge, so this part is going to be the free edge, this is going to be the nail body, and we have the nail root. The nail root is under here, and then it's going to be right below the skin here, okay? So the nail body, okay, or plate is the visible portion of the nail. It is comparable to the stratum corneum of the epidermis of the skin because it's the outermost layer, the layer that we can see it. And then with the exception that it's flattened and keratinized cells fill with a harder type of keratin and the cells are not shed, right? So below the nail body is a region of epithelium and a deeper layer of dermis. Most of the nail body appears pink because of blood flowing through the capillaries in the underlying dermis. The free edge, okay, so here this is the free edge, is the part of the nail body that may extend past the distal end of the digit, and the free edge is the white because it has the color white because there are no underlying capillaries. The nail root, okay, here the portion that we cannot see is the portion of the nail that is buried in a fold of skin. The whitish crescent-shaped area of the proximal end of the nail body, we call it the lunula, okay, here it's going to be this part here. Okay, and then lunula means little moon, okay, that's why we call it lunula. It appears whitish because the vascular tissue underneath does not show through due to a thickened region of epithelium in that area. Beneath the free edge is a thickened region of stratum corneum. We call it the hyponychium. Okay, so we can't see the hyponychium here. It's going to be like behind here, that region. Okay, and then it is the junction between the free edge and skin of the fingertip and secures the nail to the fingertip. The nail body is the skin below the nail plate that extends from the lunula to the hyponychium. The epidermis is the nail bed and it lacks a stratum granulosum. So here, So we also have the aponychium, okay, or we also call it the cuticles, okay. It's gonna be right here, okay. And then so the aponychium or cuticle is a narrow band of epidermis that extends from and adheres to the margin lateral border of the nail wall. It occupies the proximal border of the nail and consists of stratum corneum. Okay, so the portion of the epithelium proximal to the nail root is going to be the nail matrix. The superficial nail matrix cells divide mitotically to produce new nail cells. So here in the next figure, here we have a sagittal section showing internal details of the nail. So here we can see some of the structures that we couldn't see it in the previous slide. Okay, so like we said, we have the free edge. Here, this white part, right, extends past the finger or toe. And then in the previous figure, we did not see the hyponychium. We said it's here, right? It's that surface here. It secures the nail to the fingertip. Here we have the epidermis, the outermost layer. We have the dermis, the inside layer, right? And then here we would have the subcutaneous layer, right? Where we can see those adipose tissues. And then here we have the finger bone. The finger bone, we call it the phalanx. And then here we have the nail matrix. This is the epithelium proximal to the nail root. It contains dividing cells, which produces new nail cells. So speaking of the nail root, so here this part, remember we saw it in the previous figure. It was here, but we couldn't see it because it was covered by the skin. Here we have the nail root is the portion that is not visible. Here we have the cuticle, right, or the aponychium, which is the stratum corneum of the epidermis. Here we have this thing which has a moon shape, which is called lunula, is the thick white part of the nail. Here we have the nail bed, is the skin below the nail plate, okay, right under it here. And then here, this top layer is going to be the nail body, which is the visible portion of the nail. Types of skin. We have two major types of skin, right, that are recognized on the basis of certain structural and functional properties. So we have the thin, hairy skin, right, and we have the thick, hairless skin. Okay, so the greatest contributor to epidermal thickness is the increased number of layers in the stratum corneum, right? This arises in response to the greater mechanical stress in regions of thick skin. And then like we said, so stratum lucidum is that layer of the epidermis, which distinguishes between the thin skin and the thick skin, right? So the thin skin, it covers all body regions except the palms, palmar surfaces of digits and soles, whereas the thick skin, it covers the palms, palmar surfaces of digits and soles. So here, this is a good summary table to review the differences between the thick and the thin skin. Functions of skin. So here we can see some of the functions of the skin. First is thermoregulation. Okay, so this is the homeostatic regulation of the body temperature. The skin contributes to thermoregulation in two ways, either by liberating sweat at its surface and by adjusting the flow of blood in the dermis. And in response to high environmental temperature or heat produced by exercise, we have the sweat production from the eccrine sweat glands, which increases, and then the evaporation of sweat from the skin surface, it helps lower the body temperature, like you feel like you're cooling off, right? So another function of the skin is the blood reservoir. So The dermis houses an extensive network of blood vessels that carry 8 to 10% of the total blood flow in a resting adult. So for this reason, the skin acts as a blood reservoir. Also, another function of the skin is protection. Like, as we know, the skin is the largest organ of the body. It provides protection to the body in various ways. It has cutaneous sensations. So those are sensations that arise in the skin, including tactile sensations, touch, pressure, vibration, and tickling, as well as thermal sensations such as warmth and coolness. Another cutaneous sensation, we have pain, usually is an indication of impending or actual damage of tissue. There is a wide variety of nerve endings and receptors distributed throughout the skin, including the tactile discs of the epidermis, the corpuscle of touch in the dermis, and hair root plexuses around each hair follicles. And another function is excretion and absorption, and also the skin plays a role in the synthesis of vitamin D. Development of the integumentary system. So the epidermis, it develops from a single layer of the ectoderm. The dermis develops from the mesoderm, and this layer also gives rise to the erector pili and parts of the hair follicle. And then the epidermis is of a fetus is protected by a fatty substances. We call it vernix caseosa. Here we have the anatomical changes due to aging. So due to aging, you can see we get wrinkles on our skins, right? And then we have dehydration and the cracking of the skin. We have decreased sweat production. We have decreased numbers of functional melanocytes. That's why older people, they look more pale, because their melanocytes are not producing as much melanin, right? Also, loss of subcutaneous fat, marked decrease in dermal thickness, and decreased number and brittleness of collagen and elastic fibers. This is the end of the chapter on the integumentary system. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.